Great Scott. Great Scott. Great Scott.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another fabulous episode of Great Scott. I'm Scotty V. Thanks for watching. John Shea. John Shea played Lex Luthor back in the 90s on the Lois Clark New Adventures of Superman television show. A lot of people had a problem with him because he had hair, and he kind of had sex appeal, he had charm, he was kind of good looking, he was going to be a romantic interest for Lois Lane. I loved him personally. I thought he was the greatest Lex Luthor I've seen on screen. Before John Shea, we had the 50s interpretation of Luthor, or the Superman, the movie interpretation, the Gene Hackman kind of goofy, cheesy Luthor, and that has its place. It's nice and fun. We had Lex Luthor on the Superboy series, and that whole series was kind of a tad askew. We had Luthor on the radio program. We've had many interpretations of Luthor. Most of them on screen have been kind of campy, kind of cheesy, kind of silly. Michael Rosenbaum portrayed Lex Luthor for about 10 years on Smallville, and he was fantastic. We saw a different facet to Luthor. We saw a growing up Luthor. We saw a guy who was trying to do well and trying to be Clark's friend, but wanted to find out what everybody was doing, so he kept spying on them and checking them out and having cameras everywhere and keeping files on everybody, and eventually he spiraled into darkness, and that was fantastic. But my favorite Lex Luthor by far is the businessman Lex Luthor, the manipulative Lex Luthor that has people working for him and has them do all the dirty work. Lex Luthor. Not that he's afraid to get his hands dirty. He's been known to strangle a person or two. But for the most part, so that he can stay clean, he makes sure that everything gets done outside of him, so there's never any proof. Here in the final scene of Season 1 of Lois and Clark, Lex Luthor's world comes tumbling down as he's about to marry Lois Lane. Perry White and Jimmy Olsen and Inspector Henderson all jam into the room and tell him that there's finally proof. They accuse him of being a criminal. They know he's involved in stuff, and they take him down. But he gets away. He uses kung fu, and he smashes some people, and he throws over a cop, and he runs down to make sure his nemesis Superman is dead in a kryptonite cage that he built for him, but Superman has escaped, which just further pisses Lex off. He hears the police coming. He runs up to his penthouse, and he decides to jump out the window. After he does this, he dies, but then Gretchen Kelly, his doctor from the comic books, who appears in the series, brings him back later, but in a much more limited capacity. Deborah Joy Levine, who produced the show and was a huge creative force on it for the first season, said, "We never intended to have Lex Luthor be the big baddie for the whole series. We thought that would get a little stale, a little boring. So we wanted him to come back and we wanted him to be around, but we never intended to use him in the same capacity that we used him in the first season, where he was on almost every episode." John Shea, on the other hand, said that the show became too tasking for him on a personal level because he lived so far away. I think it was Montana. His family was there. He wasn't seeing his children, and he didn't want to make the trip to spend full days every day all year while they were filming anymore. But he was glad to come back and do a few episodes in every season from that time going forward. John Shea was a cool Lex, a charming Lex, a Lex who could get Lois to feel like she loved him, a Lex who could get Lois to feel like she wanted to marry him. He was a foil for Clark Kent, whom this show was about, more so than Superman, because the action in the adventure was secondary, whereas the romance and the personal plot lines of the characters was very paramount, which is why I always loved this show. But it was a little cheesy, and especially after Lex Luthor departed, the villains got goofy. We had villains like Bob, Master of the Universe, sitting playing with action figures, which I'm sure was an homage to Rick Moranis in Spaceballs, but just wasn't as funny, who was able to somehow be a foil to Superman later. And this makes Superman lesser when his enemies are goofy, and they're still able to provide some sort of a risk to Superman. It makes Superman not look as cool. But Lex Luthor, super smart. Back in the old days, he was this kind of rotund scientist who wore a lab coat and created things. And Lex could still do that. Lex, on this show, we didn't see that much of, but he had ideas. He did create the kryptonite cage, and he created some other things. Later on, he had a gun and some things that he used against Superman. So he had a scientific mind, but he wasn't per se a scientist. He was more a businessman. He was a manipulative man. He was a guy who could get things done, and he had confidence and arrogance, and he was ballsy, and he was awesome. And it was all because of John Shea, and because of the portrayal they decided to go with, which came from the John Byrne Superman reboot Man of Steel in the 80s, which was my favorite interpretation of the Lex Luthor character. I love that interpretation. I hope we see that in the Batman v Superman movie. Of course, with that, we're going with a younger Lex, a Lex that seems more a contemporary of Superman, maybe the same age or around the same age, maybe even younger. I think the actor is younger who's playing him in the Batman v Superman movie. But I've always loved Lex, and I always love when he's portrayed as a man who is really eloquent in speech, can say a lot, is smart, knows a lot, can get people to do things for him. I also like him as a bit of a ladies' man. I also like him with some martial arts skills and some self-defense skills for himself. Although it's not necessary for Lex to be a big, muscle, beefy guy because he's not the brawler. He's not the guy who gets into hand-to-hand situations with Superman. He's the guy who hurts him by doing things to him behind the scenes that Superman always knows Lex did, but that can never be proven. And I loved John Shea. This year, John Shea will be appearing at the Superman celebration on Friday the 12th and Saturday the 13th in Autograph Lane or Autograph Alley or whatever it's called. There won't be a ticket for that. Now, with the other celebrities that often come, you have to stand in line earlier and get tickets, and they only give so many out in order to get in line and get autographs from the celebrities. A lot of times the celebrities' autographs are free. By what I'm hearing and what we're reporting on the Superman homepage, there may be a fee to get an autograph from John Shea, which, as I stated with Dean Cain last year, is unfortunate. But if there was anybody that would get me to go to the Superman celebration if I was on the fence, it would be John Shea or Dean Cain. Something along those lines. Last year I wanted to go, couldn't. This year I wanted to go, couldn't. If something was going to change my mind, it would be the fact that awesome John Shea is going to be there. So the fact that you get to meet him, if you're there, have a good time, get his autograph if you like. Meet a guy who portrayed Lex Luthor in an awesome way, and I feel doesn't really get his due for playing Lex so coolly. Thanks everybody for watching, and remember, I must confess it brings me a certain satisfaction that everyone in the city has to look up in order to see me.